a range of issues. And while it is not for the United States and the Soviet Union to design the future for Europeans or for any other people, I am convinced that a cooperative U.S.-Soviet relationship can indeed make the future safer and brighter.
Let's speak to the Professor of History at Koç University, Tarik Cyril Amar, who joins us from Istanbul. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Was it already clear by the time that summit took place that the Cold War was over?
Yes, absolutely. And the reason is that the Cold War really didn't end in Malta in December 1989. We can say that that summit in Malta marked the end of the Cold War. That is true. It certified it, so to speak. But the Cold War really ended between 1987 and 1988. So it was well over by the time Malta took place. And the reason why it ended in 1987 and 88, the main reason really is that the Soviets stopped fighting it. The Soviets stopped participating in the Cold War in 87 and in 1988 effectively. So up to a year before Malta. The second reason, of course, why Malta is so important as a marker is that in 1989, just before the Malta summit, we had the Eastern European former bloc, the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, very clearly in dissolution. Now, if you would add China into the mix, which you could of course see as the third main power of the later Cold War, then things get more complicated again. But if we for now restrict our perspective to the two powers that were involved in the beginning of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, then the Cold War was well over and done with by 1989.
It's really interesting that you mentioned Eastern Europe. Can you talk to us a little bit about the role that the Pope at the time, who was of course a Pole, Pope John Paul II, and the role that he may have played in helping to bring about the end of communism in Eastern Europe? In Poland at the time, of course, there was the Solidarity movement with Lech Wałęsa against the General Jaruzelski. How much of a role did the Pope actually, do you think, actively play in pushing for an end to communism?
I think John Paul II, who was made Pope in 1978, of course, so on the sort of eve of what would happen in Poland in the early 1980s, the Solidarity movement, which you have just mentioned, John Paul II was definitely very important. There's no doubt about it. However, his importance can also be exaggerated. I don't think it's true, for instance, that John Paul II started the whole process that then went into solidarity as a challenge to the communist regime in Poland in the early 1980s. That had many roots, but he certainly gave it a big boost in 1979 when he visited the country. There's no doubt about that. And Poland, in turn, of course, was perhaps the most important member state of the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, of the Warsaw Pact military system. And the fact that Poland came under so much pressure, the Polish communist regime came under so much pressure from Solidarity and its own population, was of course another factor that pushed the Soviet leadership into a crisis. Now we have to distinguish, I think, two things here. There are two questions actually. Why did the Cold War end, and why did it end peacefully, more or less? The Soviets could have reacted differently, of course. They didn't have to react the way they did. But once the Soviets had a leader like Gorbachev in 1985, who was ready to negotiate and ready to make great changes, then, of course, a factor like Poland played a very positive role in pushing the Soviets toward ending the Cold War.
Do you think Mikhail Gorbachev actually genuinely wanted to bring about some sort of resolution to the Cold War, or was he forced into it? Because you remember when Ronald Reagan said we're going to start a Star Wars program and we're going to militarize space, the Russians had already almost overspent in trying to keep up with the Americans in the nuclear arms race. And then, of course, the Russians were losing in Afghanistan as well. So was Gorbachev's hand almost forced, or was he very much willing to make this happen?
I think in the case of Gorbachev, what we are seeing is the combination of powerful circumstances, you've outlined some of them right now, and a man with deep convictions. I think it's true that Gorbachev was some form of true believer. among other things, in a reformed socialism. He thought that was possible, but also in a reformed world system. And the end of the Cold War for him was one of his main aims. I think that was genuinely the case. Once again, you see, you have to distinguish. The Soviets had to react in some way to the problems that came out of their economic failure. They had to react to the defeat in Afghanistan. They had to react, of course, to the threat of SDI and everything that was behind that, namely a revolution in the way that the Americans computerized warfare, and the Soviets knew that. But how they reacted, there were choices. And the fact that the Soviets choose the option of seeking negotiations and making what they considered unprecedented concessions to the West, that actually was very much a question of that particular leadership. That may very well not have happened under another leader.
Do you think that, I mean, looking forward now, do you think that we might be able to almost replace the country USSR with the country China, and that we're heading into an era of a new Cold War between the United States and now with China?
Well, you know, I hope not. Because the Cold War, of course, has sometimes been called a long peace, right? But in reality, if you look at it carefully, the Cold War was bloody in many parts of the world. In Asia, in Africa, partly in Latin America, millions, literally millions of lives were lost in conflicts directly tied to the Cold War. So I hope very much that we are not going toward another age like this. What I think we can say is that we are still, or again, in a very unpeaceful and politically badly managed world, unfortunately. And we have certain features among leaderships, powerful leaderships, that resemble those of the Cold War. There's great mistrust, there's great obstinacy on all sides, and there's a mistrust in diplomacy. And I would say there's an overestimation of what you can achieve with force. There's a lack of humility, if you want. In other ways, however, not every conflict has to be like the Cold War. And my sense is that too many things have changed since the Cold War ended in terms of economics, technology, communications, ideology, so that even if we will see even more conflict, and I think that's unfortunately possible, I don't think the Cold War will be a good analogy to understand it.
Super interesting, Professor. Thank you so much indeed. Tarik, Cyril, Amar, speaking to us from Istanbul.